Welcome. This is MBA 522, and this lecture is Introduction to Decision Making, as we talk about the decision-making process and specifically how we make ethical decisions. So we just listened to that little video clip about Jonah Lehrer and some of the challenges that he had with making decisions. So let's go to the formal definition. What is decision making? And decision making is when we have to choose actions from among multiple feasible alternatives. So the goal here is we have to look at all the possibilities that may be out there that are feasible, and then ultimately choose among those to figure out what the next step will be. Of course, that opens up a lot of questions and challenges for us. Number one, do we have all the alternatives available for us? And if we do, are they always feasible? What happens if we don't have a chance to plan? We still have to make decisions, but we don't have an opportunity to take some time in advance to think about our options or to actually critically analyze these things. Next, people say, well, we should make a logical or rational decision. And of course, as we already know from the lecture from Jonah Lehrer, that rational and logical is not always the right approach. But even if we do choose rational and logical, it's rational and logical according to whom? Which of course opens up the question, is it really then easy to do a rational or logical decision? And of course, according to Jonah Lehrer, that's not true. And as we'll see through this class, that's not always true. What may be rational or logical to you is not going to be rational or logical to somebody else. In this slide, we're going to look at the traditional analytical model of decision making. Specifically, there's 8 steps that we typically follow, from identifying the problem to evaluation of the outcomes. Many times, these things can happen almost simultaneously, and certainly in a crisis, this process is short-circuited. And in fact, it comes very quickly. We tend to not generate a lot of alternatives and evaluate a lot of alternatives when we're in crisis mode, particularly if we don't have any clarity as to what's going on and why. We're more putting out fires, if you will. But the basic step-by-step process is, first we have to identify our problem, then we have to figure out the objectives for what we need to do to solve this problem. Sometimes we'll make a pre-decision, we'll start thinking about what it is that we'd like to accomplish, and that then directs us into generating and evaluating all the alternatives. And we want to make sure when we're evaluating the alternatives, we're not just thinking short-term, but we're thinking about the long-term impact of what we do. That's where a lot of mistakes happen, is when we only think in the short term, when in fact we have a long scope to be thinking about what impact we're going to have. Ultimately, after we do our evaluations, we make a decision on which alternative we're going to use. We implement that, and then of course we have to evaluate to see whether or not it makes sense to do this. So while this is a very sort of linear 8-step process, we can take our time. Sometimes we can take our time going through this, and sometimes it's a very short period of time in which these things occur. But typically we try to at least identify the problem, define the objectives, get our alternatives out there, and then make our choice. The follow-up, the evaluation, if you will, can usually happen over a longer period of time. The next slide that we're looking at now is trying to understand how individual differences affect decision making. And what we're showing you here in this next slide is 4 different types of decision making styles: directive, analytical, conceptual, and behavioral. The directive style is definitely a style for someone who needs to make very quick decisions, because they do this very rapidly. They don't really consider a lot of alternatives. They have very clear rules for making decisions, and they move very quickly through the process. In this circumstance, this works really, really well when you have a crisis or when you have a lot of pressure to make a decision quickly. It works less well when you have a lot of time and leisure, and it's a costly decision, so you want to take more time to think about all your alternatives and think about what might be an appropriate outcome. The analytical is sort of the opposite of the directive. The analytical likes the problem solving. They like to take their time and dig in and look at all the alternatives and assess what works and what doesn't work, and really try to be creative in the way that they handle solving some of these problems. Their work, again, the very opposite of the directive. When you have time, when money is important, when the costs for making a bad decision are really high, you want to take your time. You want the analytical decision maker. The downside of the analytical decision maker is that they will be more likely to engage in paralysis by analysis. In a situation with paralysis by analysis, they will get caught up in doing analyzing and may forget that they actually have to make a decision. And so you can imagine sitting on a team where you've got a directive person and an analytical person, and between the two of them, one wants to make decisions really quickly, the other one wants to take their time and analyze, and so they are in conflict with each other. It's a constant fight back and forth to make that happen. So, I'm sure you're all laughing now thinking about your own meetings where this kind of thing occurred. The next type of individual decision-making style is the conceptual style. And the conceptual style is much more focused on making sure people are getting along, and also making sure that we're thinking about the big picture, the big concept. So the conceptual people are really great idea generators, and they come up with these creative ideas, but they're really not good in the trenches getting it implemented and pushing it through. So they take a very creative approach to stuff, but at the end, it really is your analyzers that are very good at digging down into researching the possibilities of whether or not this is an option that's going to work. So they analyze the possibilities, and they make suggestions that the conceptual person can then hold on to, and then hopefully they will help implement. So you can see how they might work in conjunction with each other. Although they do very different things, they work together to bring the pie in the sky ideas, if you will, and ground them in reality by doing some really good analytical research. The behavioral is the last style, and the behavioral one is more focused on process. They're very concerned for the organization and for the members of the group, and so what they're focused on is making sure that the process works right and it works fair, and that everybody has a voice in that situation, that they are good at setting up meetings and making sure the meetings work well, and getting everything done as quickly as possible. Whereas the directive person is ready to get out there and get things done as quickly as possible, the behavioral person is saying, slow down, we need buy-in from people, we need everybody's voice. And so they also may work hand in hand with the analytical folks, because the analytical folks want to be able to do the research, and the behavioral person is saying, let's make sure everybody's voice is heard. So they're the ones sort of advocating to make sure that the analytical person's voice is being heard in the process. Each of us may have a default style, if you will. I might be more analytical as a rule, or you might be more conceptual as a rule, but in the end, as a good leader, as a good manager, you have to recognize when you have to put on your directive hat and when you put on your behavioral hat, when an analytical style makes better sense than a conceptual style, or when they might work best together. You should learn how to adapt your style based on what the situation needs. If you can't do that, at the bare minimum, what you need to do is recognize that if you're analytical and you need a directive person to get through and make decisions quickly, that's what you want to put your emphasis on. You want to say, look, I need you to do this. We need to make a decision. You're really good at assessing a situation quickly and making a good decision, and whereas I take more time, so that's how we want to do it. And again, you may decide that the directive style works well. So even if you're not directive yourself, or you're not conceptual yourself, or you're not behavioral or analytical, but the style requires one of those, you know when to take a step back and let that person on your team who's good at that shine. So obviously, we'd all like to be able to develop the skills to be broad in our decision-making styles, but if we can't do that, the second best thing is to recognize when that style is appropriate and to take the step back and recognize that, this style is more appropriate in this situation, and that's not my strength, so I'll take that step back. So how do individuals make decisions? We've talked about different decision-making styles. We've talked about how individual differences and culture and things like that influence decisions, but how do people actually make decisions? And what we have in this slide are two basic contrasting points of view. The first one is the rational economic model. And as you remember from the first audio clip that you were supposed to listen to from Jonah Lehrer, that rational economic model isn't always very rational because it assumes that we're making logic to maximize decisions, but in fact, we still have to tap into emotion. Logical machines don't always make the best decisions. For individuals to make decisions, we do have to allow emotion to come into play. So, of course, as much as Mr. Spock would argue that logic and pure logic and no emotion is the best way to make decisions, we know better. Live long and prosper, Mr. Spock and Leonard Nimoy. Really, in reality, while we should make decisions using the rational economic model, the bottom line is we are more likely to make decisions using the bounded rationality model. And what does that basically mean? It means that because we are very limited in our ability to process and gather information, we tend not to make optimal decisions, but we find the one that is minimally satisfying. So sufficiently satisfying us. So suffice or satisfice is the way we work it. We can't find all the alternatives. It's not possible. The rational economic model works really, really well with very simple programmed decisions because we know all the options, we know all the goals, we know everything. It's all agreed on and it's available to us. But most decisions are more complex than that, and it requires us to use our emotions and past experience, and many times we're trying to make decisions without emotion, without experience, and with having to make a decision in this area in the first place. So our bounded rationality is really about finding the minimally satisfying solution. As long as it meets our minimum criteria, it addresses what we need, we will satisfice, we will deal with it sufficiently satisfying to be able to use it. So you can see on the right hand side the little graphic, maximizers, people who are looking for the rational economic model to maximize goals. They exhaustively seek the best, they compare decisions with others, they expend an enormous amount of time and energy and are many times more unhappy with their outcomes. Whereas satisficers are looking at, is it good enough? Will it solve our issues? And when we're in a crisis or when we have unknown information, sometimes it's all you can do. Is it good enough? We may not be able to get to the optimal decision simply because we have multiple constituencies that we're trying to juggle. So we need to find the minimally satisfying solution for all the constituents that are involved. So satisficers accept good enough. They don't obsess about options. They move on. They leave it behind them and they keep going, and they tend to be more happier with outcomes. So when you're trying to really make the perfect decision, give it up. It's going to be very challenging to do, particularly when you have enormous numbers of variables that you're juggling in your head. And as again, going back to the Jonah Lehrer lecture, the struggle that one has is really around how do we address the fact that there are so many variables out there, that our brain is so limited, and that, emotions are going to play a role here. We don't want to have, paralysis by analysis. We don't want to have inertia in having an inability to make a decision because it's just too overwhelming. We want to be able to go in, make a decision as best as possible, and move on. So my guess would be that directive decision makers are much more likely to use bounded rationality. They look at what's minimally satisfying, they quickly assess the situation, and they move on through it, whereas analyzers tend more towards trying to find the best solution because they want to have all the information known. Again, that's not a rule of thumb, but you can see how that might map somewhat appropriately.